I think people see the output of models like, DALL-E, GPT-3, et cetera, and they're amazed by what AI can do. And so the conversation doesn't even hinge on like, we have access to this data set or we have access to this talent pool. It's more AI is magical. What can we do with it? And again, I think that is somewhat dangerous.
You're listening to Gradient Descent, a show about machine learning in the real world, and I'm your host, Lucas Biewald. Sarah Catanzaro was a practicing data scientist and then went into venture. She's currently a general partner at Amplify Partners and one of the leading investors in AI and ML. Her investments include a whole bunch of companies I admire like Runway ML, OctoML, Gantry, and others. It's really interesting to talk to an investor who's also technical. She has insights both on how the technology is built and how it's being adopted by the market at large. This is a really fun conversation and I hope you enjoy it. Sarah, thanks so much for doing this. I've been looking forward to this one. I had a bunch of questions prepped and then I was looking at your Twitter and I was like, ooh, there's like a whole bunch of other stuff that we should...
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've been doing a lot of like thinking out loud recently, including in response to like a lot of the hype around stable diffusion, LLMs, etc. I appreciate the fact that like both of us were there in the like 2013, 2014 phase where like every company was claiming to be an AI company, and it feels like we're kind of like heading down that road again, which like scares me a little bit. And I hope at least like there are enough like companies, people who like remember the lessons of like the last AI renaissance. But we'll see.
Well, let's get right into it then, because I'll say from my perspective, I totally remember like at least one other AI bubble, maybe more depending on how you count it. But I guess from where I sit, it feels like this one might be different in the sense that I feel like these challenges that were always, seemed like super, super hard, like seem like they're really working. And I feel like I see like applications happening like unbelievably fast after the paper comes out, actually even maybe before there's like time to even publish any paper on the topic. So I think I might be more bullish about large language models and stable diffusion than you, which is great because we can actually have an interesting conversation here. But I thought it was interesting, like you've invested in Runway, and just the other day Chris was showing me like a natural language input into Runway where you could basically type what you want and it would sort of like set up the video editing to work that way. And I thought, oh my gosh, like this might be a totally new kind of interface that lots of software might quickly adopt, I guess. But it sounds like, looking at your Twitter, it sounds like you were playing with large language models and finding it super frustrating and broken. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I think like my concern is less about like the capabilities of large language models specifically, and more about like some of the lessons that we learned during the last AI renaissance, which I think was like roughly like 2014 to like maybe 2017, around the time that like AlphaGo came out. People were really excited about like the capabilities of like GANs and RL. And at the time, I remember, companies like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, like building these big research teams, but not really having like a clear agenda for those research teams, or understanding like how the objectives of their research teams might align with like the objectives of like the broader organization. And then similarly, you saw all of these startup founders emerge that were talking about like changing healthcare with GANs, or like changing finance with RL, but didn't really have like insights into the like nuances of those industries. And so like my feeling of why ML didn't work the last time around, or rather like why ML adoption didn't occur at the pace that we anticipated, was that it was not really like a technical problem, but rather like product go-to-market problem. Um, I am hoping that, this time around, like we've both learned from our mistakes, but also that in the intervening time period, created enough like enabling technologies um, such that like two things can occur. One is that like companies can fail fast. Uh, Frankly, like one of the things that scares me is that like back then I remember like a bunch of companies reaching out and basically saying things like, hey, like we've got a bunch of data, like we'd love for you to come in and talk to us about our AI strategy. And thinking like, I don't care if you have a bunch of data, let's talk about like a bunch of problems that you have and how, ML can solve those problems. Um, I've come to believe that like you can't fight that urge, that like founders will always be enticed by like the promise of AI. But if they're able to like experiment with it quickly, then I think they can start to learn more about like the infrastructure and data and other investments that they may need to make in order for their AI initiatives to be successful. Um, at the same time, I think by creating like these higher level interfaces that make ML more accessible to like potentially like the domain expert, um, it allows people with a more thorough understanding of business problems to at least like prototype AI solutions. Like I'm somewhat skeptical that like these very high level interfaces will allow them to kind of like build production ML at scale, but at least they can see like, does it work? And do I need to now like hire a data and ML team to like realize this initiative further?
Do you have companies in mind that you like that are kind of creating these higher level interfaces off of ML technology that makes them usable for real world applications?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like Runway is actually a perfect example of like the phenomena that I see playing out. Uh, some people may not know, but like Runway actually kind of started off more as like a model marketplace. Their goal had been to like make GANs and other types of models accessible to creative professionals, but they weren't really focused on building out the video editing tools, at least initially. Um, so they created these higher level interfaces such that like various creative professionals, whether it was artists or directors or photographers, could start to like experiment with ML models. Um, and what they saw was that some of the most popular models were models that automated routine tasks associated with video editing. And so, like based on that user behavior, they decided to double down on video editing. And in fact, like a lot of the model architectures that they've since created, including Stable Diffusion, were really like purpose built to support the workflows of video editors. So like I like that sort of workflow where you use a prototype or like you use these higher level interfaces to get insight into what users need, as well as like potentially the limitations of the underlying technology. And then you iterate from there.
So I totally remember a time, I think of the era you're talking about, 2014 to 2017, when, every company was like, oh, we have this data, like it must be valuable because we can, build a model on top of it. Do you see some analogy today to that? Like what's the common like request of like a ML team that's, misguided or should be thinking more about problems? Because I feel like data maybe isn't seeming quite as valuable in a world of LLMs and big models.
Yeah. So I think like what we're seeing today is arguably like more nefarious than what we saw back then, because at least at that point in time, companies had invested in collecting data. They had thought about possibly like what data to collect. And so there was some understanding of like how to work with data. I think people see the output of models like, DALL-E, GPT-3, et cetera, and they're amazed by what AI can do. And so the conversation doesn't even hinge on like, we have access to this data set, or we have access to this talent pool, or we have this type of workflow that could benefit from these like generative capabilities. It's more AI is magical. What can we do with it? Come in and talk to us about this. And again, I think that is somewhat dangerous. I was at a conference just last week, and there was a presentation on ML infrastructure at like a music company. And somebody in the audience asked, like, does the AI listen to songs? And, it's a perfectly like reasonable question, but I think it does kind of belie some of the misunderstanding of AI and how it works.
I guess in what sense?
I think people think about AI as like artificial agents. They think of AI as something that could listen to a song, not just something that could like represent a song and make like predictions based upon the content of that song. So again, I think like better understanding what LLMs are and what they can do will be really necessary, like to identify when they can be useful.
This is like a little bit of a softball, or might sound like a softball, but I was like really genuinely interested in this. I feel like one of the things that you do really well, at least in my, conversations with you, is kind of maintain a pretty deep technical and current knowledge of what's going on in like data stacks, basically, or like data infrastructure and ML infrastructure. But yet, you're not like maintaining data infrastructure as far as I know. And so I'm kind of curious how you stay on top of a field that like seems like it requires such like hands-on engagement to understand it well, or at least I feel like it does for me. Just curious what your process is.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I'd say that like in some ways that is one of my biggest concerns. I've been in venture now for about 7 years, and so I can still say that like I spent most of my career in data, but it won't be long before like that is no longer true. And certainly I have found that like my practical technical skills have gotten rustier. One comment on that is that I do think that like losing my Python, SQL skills, et cetera, has actually enabled me to like look at some of the like tools and platforms that are available to users today with like a fresh set of eyes. I'm not as like entrenched in the same patterns of behavior and workflows as I was when I was a practitioner. So it's been like helpful to like shed some of my biases. But I think what I've discovered is that like you can understand how something works without using it. And therefore, like there are two things that are kind of like critical to building technical understanding for me. One is just spending a lot of time with practitioners and hearing about like their experiences, how they're using various tools, how they're thinking about like various sets of technologies. And frankly, like just learning from them, it almost feels like a shortcut. Like, hey, instead of like trying to figure out what the difference is between like automated prompting and like prefix tuning, just going to ask somebody and have a conversation with them, and which is kind of like coincidental and perhaps even ironic, and accelerate my learning by just learning from people with expertise in those areas. So there's a lot that like I just learned through conversation with practitioners. But I think like going one level deeper, either like reading white papers or reading research papers, that give you kind of a high level overview of an architecture or how something works without getting into like the nitty gritty of the underlying like code or math. Allows me to kind of like reason about these components at a practical level of abstraction. Like I can see how things fit together. I understand how they work. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'd be able to implement them. Definitely doesn't mean that I'd be able to iterate on them, but it's like enough depth to reason about like a component and its place in a broader technical stack.
It's funny though, sometimes I feel like investors, I mean, all investors do that to some extent, and I totally get why. But I think that I often feel also paranoid about like losing my technical skills, because I feel like if all you can do is sort of like figure out what box something belongs to, it's really hard for you to evaluate the things that don't fit into boxes. And I feel like almost all the interesting advances, and actually all the products that, we want to come out with at Weights and Biases, generally is stuff where it's like doesn't fit neatly into one of those like ML workflow, diagrams that people make. Because like if it was one of those boxes, then, of course people are doing it because it, it makes logical sense. But it's sort of when that stuff gets reshuffled, and it does seem like you're able to maintain a much greater level of technical depth than the average, the average investor, even in the data space, which is why I wanted to have you on this podcast. I hope I'm not offending any of my current investors. I just caveat there. You all are wonderful, but I really do feel like you somehow maintained a much greater technical depth than most of your colleagues.
So in many ways, like I'm amazed by my colleagues and like what they do, because I think there are many investors that can reason about like the growth of companies and reason about like sets of boxes and the relationships between those boxes without understanding what those boxes do. I don't think I could do that, but I've always also just been the type of person who like needs to go a little bit deeper. As an example, like I started my career in data science, but at Amplify, like I also invest in databases. And at some point, like writing SQL queries, working with data frames, like I just wanted to better understand like what was happening. Like when I write a SQL query and data shows up in my SQL workbench, like what is happening on my computer? I think like a lot of people kind of take that stuff for granted, and they can. Like that is the beauty of abstractions. That is the beauty of technology. Like we are able to have this video conference. We are able to connect over the internet without understanding how the internet works. But like my personality is as such that like I want to understand how the internet works. I want to understand like why I have service in some places and why I don't have service, and like why my data frame is slower than my like SQL query. And I do think that makes me think about like technical systems and in different ways.
That's funny. My co-founder Sean is obsessed with in technical interviews, like assessing if someone understands how the computer works, in his words, which I think is really interesting, because I feel like I'm actually not like that. That's kind of like a weakness of mine. Like I always wonder like about a lot of the details there, but it is sort of an interesting, perspective. Like, I love working with all of my colleagues because they have that same, drive to understand how everything works. Okay, here's another question that I was wondering. I was thinking about, if I were to come to you and I had like a company in the data or ML space, and I had a bunch of customers that were like really who we think of as like tech forward, like say like Airbnb and Google and I don't know, that genre. Would that be more impressive, or would you be more thinking I'm likely to succeed than if I came to you with a set of customers who we don't normally think of as tech forward, like say like an insurance company, like a large insurance company and a large like, pharma company? Like which would you look at and say, ooh, that seems like that company's going to succeed? Because like part of me sort of like watches technology sort of flow, from the more tech forward companies everywhere. But another part of me is like, wow, these kind of less tech forward companies have a whole set of different needs and often like a different tech stack. And certainly there's more of them and they have more budget for this stuff. So which would be the more impressive pitch for you?
Yeah. No, it's funny because I think like in many ways, like the way that like VCs make decisions, the way that like we think about deals is actually like super similar to some of the patterns that we observe with like neural networks. And that of course means that like we have bias. It also means that like we learn from patterns that we've observed. So I can give you the honest answer, and then I can also give you the rational answer. The honest answer is that I would be more impressed by a company that has engaged with tech forward customers for the reasons that you described. Like in the past, we have generally seen that like tech will spread from the Airbnbs and Ubers and Fangs of the world into the enterprise and not the other way around. We also have a bias that like these more traditional enterprises tend to move slower. There tends to be like a lot of bureaucratic red tape that you need to navigate. And like as such, those markets tend to be like less attractive. So on its face, like if you just said you don't have any additional information about like the velocity of sales, about like the quality of the tech or team, et cetera. But like
or
here are two
holding them
equivalent
equal,
companies.
I guess. Yeah, equivalent.
Yeah. That said, I think like that is one of the biases that can cause us to make poor decisions. What really matters are some of the things that I just alluded to. Like if you're able to sell into insurance companies repeatedly and with high velocity, like that is arguably like a better business than a company that spends 6 to 12 months trying to sell into tech companies. So it's less about like to whom do you sell and more about like, is that a big market? Are you able to sell efficiently? Are you able to sell scalably? And I think like sometimes we need to be like aware of our biases and the impact that like marquee logos can have on our decision making.
But it sounds like well, I can't tell if you think it's like a rational bias or not. I mean, in some sense, you could call all pattern matching biases. But do you really think it would be rational to sort of like be less enamored with tech forward customers than you actually are?
So I think we need to ask ourselves and probe on like under what circumstances might enterprises move quickly. A great example of this is like a company called Afresh, which was one of the companies that did use RL to like disrupt an industry at that time that like so many companies were trying to do the same thing but like didn't have as much insight into like what was happening within an industry. So they offer tech solutions, including for things like inventory management and forecasting to companies in the grocery space. Now, you might think that like grocery is going to be like a super, outdated, slow moving industry. And therefore that like selling into grocery chains would be like long and tedious and perhaps like not very scalable. But, at the time, like a lot of like grocery stores were responding to or like otherwise just terrified by like the acquisition of Whole Foods by Amazon. This was, then proceeded by like the pandemic, which certainly put a lot of stress on their online and kind of like multi-channel delivery and e-commerce capabilities. And so like there were these exogenous shocks, which made what might have been like slow moving market participants move a lot faster. And I think like those are the phenomena that we're sometimes blind to because we just hear like grocery or healthcare or like manufacturing and think slow, rather than thinking like, what would it take for the participants in that sector to move fast?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Okay, here's another point that you made on Twitter that I was contemplating, and I actually don't think I have a strong point of view on this, although I really should, given the company that I'm running. But you mentioned like a lot of, I think VCs have been saying that you expect, the point solution, MLOps to like, space to consolidate. And I guess like one thing that's interesting about that is that I think you've invested in some MLOps tools. So do you sort of expect them to sort of like expand in scope and like eat the other companies? Like, is that something that you need to bet on when you invest in them, or would you be sort of happy to see them get bought by other tools? Or how do you think about investment then in MLOps tools company with that worldview? That's my practical question. And then I guess the other thing that I observe is that it doesn't necessarily seem like developer tools in general is consolidating. So I think I might even agree with you, but I wonder how you sort of pattern match that against developer tools, or even maybe like the data stack. I don't know. Do you think that the data stack is also consolidating, or what's going on there? Sorry, I just dumped a whole bunch of different questions on you, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Those are great questions. So I do think that like in general, most technical tools and platforms will go through like phases of consolidation and like decoupling, or as people love to say today, like bundling and unbundling.
Right.
I think it's just the nature of like point solutions versus end-to-end platforms. Like you have a bunch of point solutions, they're difficult to maintain, they may be challenging to integrate. You then kind of like bias towards like end-to-end platforms. You adopt an end-to-end platform. It doesn't like address a certain edge case or like a use case that you're experiencing. So you buy a new tool for like that edge case. Instead, unbundling happens. And I think like the pendulum will always swing back and forth between like bundling and unbundling for that reason, or like coupling and decoupling for that reason. To be clear, like as a former buyer, I don't think that like point solutions or end-to-end platforms are like the best solutions like for a company. I think like there's space in the middle where you have a product that can solve a few adjacent problems. And so that's typically like what I look for when I invest. I want to make sure that like the company in which I'm investing is solving an urgent and often like point problem. They're solving an urgent and specific problem. However, I typically also want to see that like the founder has a hypothesis about like how they would expand into adjacent problem in areas. So it's not that I think solving point problems is bad, but I do think like given the pendulum of coupling and decoupling, like having some hypotheses about like the areas that you can expand into becomes critical. It's interesting to consider why this may or may not happen in the world of like developer tools. I'd argue that like you still see consolidation. However, the consolidation tends to happen across like layers of the stack versus across the workflow.
Interesting. What do you tell me? What do you imagine? What are you thinking of there?
Things like serverless, where you're no longer like reasoning about like resources and config. That might not be impacting like other parts of your developer workflow. Like that might not be eating into your like Git-based development workflows or your like testing processes and things like that. But it is eating into, how you think about like managing VMs or containers. It is possibly like eating into how you think about working with like cloud vendors and deciding upon like underlying hardware and things like that. So it might be the case that like in software development, like we've seen companies or we've seen like vendors solve specific problems, but solve those like all the way down the stack. I haven't really thought about that as deeply. But I think, it's a worthwhile question to ask. I would say that like one of the big differences though that I see and that we of course need to be mindful of is that like there are far more developers than there are data practitioners. And so when you're trying to answer the question, like, how does this thing get big? Those building developer tools can arguably like solve a specific problem for a larger number of people versus data teams when you're trying to answer this question of like, how does this get big? You could potentially get stumped just by like the number of people for whom a tool is actually applicable.
And is that what gives you the intuition that we're in a moment of bundling, that there's just all these kind of point solutions that you feel like kind of can't survive on their own, just given the size of the market that they're in?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a combination of things. I think on one hand, I see like a lot of the slivers are getting tinier. You start to see things like model deployment solutions for like computer vision, and perhaps, some subset of like computer vision architectures, where you might think to yourself, like, okay, I understand why the existing tools are maybe not like optimal for that specific use case, but that's really narrow. And like, to my point about thinking about like these orthogonal problems, like it's unclear like how you go from that to something meatier. So that's one phenomena that I observe. I think the other is just that like practitioners are really, really struggling to stitch things together. The way a friend put it to me about like a year ago, he basically said he feels like, vendors are handing him a steering wheel and an engine and a dashboard and, a chassis and saying like, build a fast, safe car. And those components might not even fit together. And there's no instruction manual. And it's easy to like cast shade on the startups that are like building these tools and platforms. But I think one of the things that is more challenging in the ML/AI space than even like data and analytics is that like a lot of the ML engineering and ML development workflows are really heterogeneous now. So if you're a vendor and you're trying to think about like, okay, with whom should I partner? With whom should I integrate? Like, do I spend time on supporting this integration? It's tougher to make those decisions when like practices and workflows are so fragmented and heterogeneous. So I do think that creating like more of a cohesive ecosystem has been difficult, not because like vendors are dumb, but because there's just a lot going on.
I think the other challenge maybe is that when there's so many like different technologies that people want to like integrate into what they're doing, because there's so much exciting research and like things that, come along, based on like different frameworks and so on. It's hard to imagine like an end-to-end system that would actually be able to absorb like every possible, like model architecture, like immediately, as fast as companies like want to actually use it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I have been thinking about this in the context of LLMs. Like, we don't yet know how the consumers or like users of pre-trained models are going to interact with those who create the pre-trained models. Like, will they be doing their own fine tuning? Uh, will they be doing their own prompt engineering? Will they just be interacting with the LLM via API? And without like insight into those interaction models, it's really hard to think about like building the right set of tools. It's also unclear to me if like the adoption of LLMs would actually imply that we need a new set of tools, both for model development and deployment and management and production. Uh, so I have a lot of empathy for people who are building ML tools and platforms because like it's a constantly moving target. Um, and yet, there's the expectation that though you're able to support like heterogeneity in all regards, like whether it's the model architecture, the data type, or like the hardware backend, or the team structure, or the user skill set. Like there's so much that is different from like org to org. So I think building great tools is really challenging right now.
I guess that's a good segue to a question I was going to ask you. When you look at LLMs, do you have an intuition on if a new set of tools are needed to make these functional?
Yeah. So I mean, I think like one of the bigger questions that I have is again like on how the consumers of LLMs or how the users of LLMs will actually interact with those LLMs, and more specifically, um, will who will own fine tuning.
Yeah.
Um, I I imagine that like there are certain challenges that will need to be addressed, both with regards to like how we collaborate on the development of LLMs, but also how we think about like the impact of iterations on LLMs. So, for example, if OpenAI wants to retrain one of their models or like otherwise tweak the architecture, how do they evaluate the impact of that change on all of the people who are interfacing with the GPT-3 API or with any of their other products? I think a lot of the tools that were built for model development and deployment today kind of assumed that the people who were developing models would be the same set of people, or at least like within the same corporate umbrella as those who are deploying and managing models in production. And if LLMs drive a shift wherein those who are developing models and those who are deploying and building applications around models are two completely separate parties, then some of the tools that we have today might be ill suited for that context.
Do you think we're headed towards a world like that where there's like a small number of companies generating foundational models and then mostly what other companies are doing is fine tuning them or doing some kind of like prompt engineering to get good results out of them?
So here we're getting a little bit into the like technical nitty gritty, but like my impression from tracking like the research community so far has been that although LLMs are great for like what we typically think of as like unstructured data, primarily like images, text, video, etc., audio too. They have not like outperformed like gradient boosting or like more traditional methods on structured data sets, including like tabular and time series data. Although there's some work on like time series that I think is pretty compelling. This is one of those areas where I feel like the research community just completely underestimates how many businesses operate on structured data. While it's possible that adoption of LLMs will drive like this new interaction model or like new market model wherein some companies build these large foundation models and others interact with those. I don't see like gradient boosting or like more classical approaches going anywhere, because I don't see structured data going anywhere. Arguably, like structured data powers many of the most critical use cases within organizations, like ranging from search and recommendation engines to like fraud detection. And I think it would be a tragedy to kind of like neglect the needs of those who are using I don't want to say like simpler approaches, but certainly simpler approaches and more complex approaches, but using architectures that are not perhaps like attention based when working with like these specific data sets.
Interesting. Do you have an opinion on how to say this? I feel like many investors, especially, but I think like many smart people looking at the space of, ML and data, they think, wow, like, this is gonna kind of commoditize, like, this is gonna get like, tools are gonna make this easier. Like, less companies are gonna want to do this internally and spend money on expensive resources. But I guess when I look at what companies actually do, is it seems like they spend more and more, and even like, like kind of push up the salaries and have this like fight for, scarce specific talent. So I guess which way do you sort of predict things are going? Like, do you think like 10 years down the road, ML salaries like go up, or do they go down? Maybe it's a more concrete way of putting that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd probably expect that like the variance would increase. So my guess is that like there are certain applications that may be commoditized, or at least that may be commoditized for some subset of the market, while others continue to be pursued in-house. Like search is perhaps like a very interesting example. For some businesses, they may be like more than happy to rely upon like a vendor to provide semantic or like vector-based search capabilities. While search may have an impact on their bottom line, perhaps it's not like the most critical or like most impactful thing to their business, but rather like just a capability that they have. So this is not to say that like Slack actually like uses a like vendor or should use a vendor, but like as far as I can tell, like Slack doesn't really like monetize on search. You'd contrast that, however, with like an e-commerce business or something like Google, where their ability to deliver like the highest quality search results and their ability to like improve search just marginally could be a huge impact on revenue. And those companies are probably likely to develop, their own models. So I think we'll see that some companies do their own model development. Some use cases are not commoditized, and those companies for those use cases you see very high ML salaries. But then perhaps like for others, like you're really just a software engineer who knows like a little bit about ML and can interface with some of these models like through APIs, and can reason about like the output of experiments and behavior that you might see in production.
I guess in that vein, and you sort of alluded to this earlier a little bit, like what do you think about all these sort of like low code and no code interfaces into, into exploring data, building ML models. I mean, I think you mentioned earlier that you think that's like generally like a really exciting trend.
So my like opinions on this category are pretty nuanced. So I was thinking about like where to start.
Okay. Yeah.
Generally speaking, like I'm very skeptical of like no code, low code solutions. I find that like many of these tools, no matter like what the sector, what the use case, they end up like shifting the burden of work, not necessarily like removing that burden or even lightening that burden. So a great example is like self-service analytics. Like my own belief is that in general, like most self-service analytics tools don't actually like reduce the burden that like the data team or analytics team bears, but rather like shift the work of the data team from building analytics products to like debugging, explaining, or fixing analytics products. And I think like the same can be true in the ML space. Why I'm excited about like some of these tools in the ML space is that I actually think that in ML, failing fast is really critical. Um, and some of these tools that enable users to like prototype ML-driven solutions might help them better understand like, is this going to work? What additional investments do I need? What do my users expect from the system before they make a decision to invest further? So it enables that kind of like quick prototyping, learning, and failing fast. The other thing that I feel quite strongly about is that we need to explore ways to kind of like decouple model development and ML-driven app development. Whenever I talk to companies about like their ML architectures or their ML stack, it becomes so obvious that like ML is just this one tiny component in a much larger app architecture where you know, the prediction service might be connecting with other databases or stream processing systems or other microservices, tools for like authorization and so on and so forth. And so like I think it's really important to be able to like build applications around a prediction service while independently like iterating on the model that powers that prediction service. And so I am somewhat long on tools that enable engineers to prototype ML-driven systems so that they can build those application architectures. And then once they have a better understanding of kind of the full system requirements, including some of the latency associated with things like moving data around, they can kind of pass off a fuller spec to a data scientist who will iterate on the model and model architecture armed with the knowledge that like these are the attributes that we need in order to make this project successful.
That makes sense. Okay, another question. When you invest in a company that is like providing like some kind of like ML or data service, does it cross your mind, like what if AWS does that, or like, GCP or Azure? Like, is that an important thing to consider, do you think, or is that irrelevant?
Yeah. I smile because I feel like this question, it comes up somewhere between like 1 to 5 times a week, given the areas that Amplify invests in, where we're primarily focused on data and ML tools and platforms, enterprise infrastructure, and developer tools. Like we're constantly fielding this question of like, what if, AWS or GCP or Azure does this? Won't, that company won't like that market, et cetera, get crushed? In the past, what I've told people is that like I have found that startups tend to be better at building developer experiences. Like anecdotally, this is just something that we observe. People complain a lot about like the experience of using AWS tools, the experience of using things like SageMaker. And I've thought a little bit more about like why that's the case. I think generally speaking, like the cloud vendors need to develop for their uh, most spendy customers, like they're like highest paying customers. And their highest paying customers tend to be enterprises, shockingly. And as such, like they're developing for an enterprise user who probably has like fairly strict privacy security requirements, who may have like a very distinct way of like organizing their teams, who may be bringing in a persona with like a specific skill set into like data science or ML roles. So if I had to present a hypothesis about like why they haven't been able to compete on developer experiences, I think it's because often they are creating tools and platforms for a developer who is not as representative of the rest of the market. But to be honest, like with the passage of time, I've just seen enough examples of companies that have been able to outcompete the cloud vendors where like I just don't worry about it that much anymore.
Have you ever seen anyone get crushed? Has that happened in your career?
No, not. I mean, I'm sure it has, but it's hard for me to think of an example. Whereas like it's easy to think of many, many examples of companies that were not crushed by the cloud vendors. If anything, I think like sometimes we see that like startups get they sell too soon. Yeah. Like the way in which the cloud vendors outcompete them is putting some juicy acquisition offer in front of them, and then they don't have to compete. So like that's the only example that I could see or think of like off the top of my head of like the cloud vendors like crushing a potential competitor. Like they crush it with their dollars. They suffocate companies with their acquisition offers.
R&D through M&A.
Yeah.
So I saw an interview or a conversation that you had with Andrew Ng, and I thought you had an interesting point that, academic benchmarks, they often don't really reflect industry use cases, but you're kind of pointing out that industry, has some share of the blame for this. Could you say more on that topic?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I am really grateful to Andrew for actually like drawing my attention to this issue. I think like we often think about like the gap between like research and industry, but we don't as often think about like the gap between like industry and research. And so, Andrew and I had been talking about this challenge of like structured data versus unstructured data. And I think I said to him, like, what I see in industry is that most ML teams are working with tabular and time series data. What I see in the research community is that like most researchers are building new model architectures for unstructured data. And so like there's a big mismatch between what like model architectures people in industry need, given the data that is available to them, as well as like given the types of problems that they're trying to solve, and like the research that's becoming available. Now, he pointed out to me, and this is something that I hadn't really thought about before, researchers have access to unstructured data. They have access to things like ImageNet. They don't have access to like high volumes of data on user sessions or, logs, metrics, and events. And like the data sets that like tend to be like the lifeblood of most companies. And it is very difficult to like innovate on, AI techniques for data sets to which you have zero access. So, I think it's easy to like point at research and be like, there's such a big gap between like what they're building and what we need. But But I think we also need to be mindful of like what the research community can do given the resources that they have available to them. I've seen like a couple of efforts by a few organizations to like open source their data sets, but it's tough because like uh, oftentimes the most valuable data sets are like the most sensitive ones. Like what company wants to share their like click through data that would uh, probably like reveal, the state of their business, some of the experiments that they're running, and so on and so forth.
Well, there's also not a lot of upside. I mean, I remember the Netflix contest was like such a popular, awesome thing, got so many people involved, so much attention and research to Netflix, still like a seminal data set, right? But they didn't do a second one because they felt like, there were user privacy issues that they couldn't get around to release it. Or I don't know if you remember when AOL released their, a subset of their query logs. It was so exciting to actually have that. I was in research at the time and I was like, this data set is like gold. And then like the next day they fired the person that released it and their boss, I think their boss's boss, right? Because, there was somehow person identifying information in that. So it's hard to see like a lot of upside, for corporations, even if they were sort of neutral on the impact of, on the sort of like, company secrets IP issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the things that I have seen that has been very encouraging is like more and more kind of interview studies or like meta-analyses coming out of the like research community, where it's clear that like the researchers are interested in better understanding the problems that practitioners face in industry. One critique that I've had of those studies in the past is that like the authors tend to interview people to whom they have immediate access, which means that they often interview practitioners at like some of their like funding organizations, the organizations that are sponsoring their labs, which means that they tend to bias more towards like larger enterprises or like the FANG companies. So like they're interviewing people at Facebook, Apple, Tesla on their like data and ML tools, platforms, practices, and then drawing conclusions about like all of industry. But I think that, recently I've seen a couple of studies come out where there's been a more focused effort to get a more like random, or at least, more diverse sample of practitioners from like both smaller startups, more traditional companies, bigger tech companies, et cetera, to really better understand like both the similarities and differences between how they approach model development and deployment. And I hope that, that continues.
Do you have a study that's top of mind that you could point us to?
Yeah. So Shreya Shankar, who had actually been a
university associate. Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I was really thrilled because like Shreya actually reached out to us and said like, hey, can you connect us to people at different types of companies? Like I've got connections to people at Instagram, Facebook, Apple, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I want to talk to people at mid-market companies or like early stage startups and B2B companies and like better understand some of the nuances of their workflows.
And what was the name of the paper? I think I just saw it.
Operationalizing Machine Learning, an Interview Study.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. That was an excellent paper.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I had said, I like, sent Shreya a text message after reading through it. The other thing that I really appreciated about the interview study was that she didn't like cherry pick the insights that were most likely to drive like interesting research questions or solutions. I think she took like a really genuine and unbiased approach to thinking about like, what are the problems that people are talking about? And what are the ways in which they're solving them? And, let's highlight that like there are a bunch of problems that people are just solving in practical, albeit like hacky ways, but ways that like they're content with. So I thought it was a very honest study.
Totally. I totally agree. Well, I guess if we are possibly headed towards another bubble in machine learning or machine intelligence, I guess as you sometimes call it, do you have any advice for a startup founder like me, or maybe like an ML practitioner, which is like most of our audience? Like, I mean, having gone through like another bubble, how would you think about it? What would you do if you sort of start this? I think we are already seeing bubble-esque behavior. What are the lessons?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most critical lesson that like I saw learned like the last time around was like focus on your users, or like focus on the like strategic problems that you're trying to solve, and really, really understand if and why ML is the best tool to solve that problem. I think it's critical to think about like machine learning as a very important tool in our toolkit, but one of several tools. Like I was catching up with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and she had mentioned to me that like the way in which she prioritizes ML projects is through regular conversations with their product leadership and engineering leadership, and her representing ML leadership, about like the product roadmap, about like the user behaviors that they're trying to unlock, and then thinking about like whether ML or traditional software development approaches are like a better tool for achieving those things. And I think like as long as we continue to think about ML as a tool to solve problems, and as long as we have the tools that enable us to better understand if ML is solving those problems, and how to improve upon its ability to solve those problems, then ML can be a super powerful tool, and one that we learn to wield in more powerful ways too. But I feel almost like a broken record saying this, given the lessons learned in the past. Like, if we treat ML like a silver bullet, if we treat it like a hammer looking for a nail, like that was the pattern that I think led to failure. Don't think about like what ML can do for you. Think about like what you can do for your country, and if ML is the right way to do that, I guess. I think that's the lesson that we learned, and I hope it's the lesson that we will carry forth.
I love it. We always end with two open-ended questions, and the first of the two is, if you had extra time, what's something that you'd like to spend more time researching? Or put another way, what's an underrated topic in data or machine learning?
Oh man, that one is like very easy for me, like programming languages. Ooh. I would love to spend more time like learning about like programming languages. Like, I am definitely not convinced that like Python is the right interface for data science, or that SQL is the right interface for analytics work. But I would really love to learn more about like programming language design, so that I could better diagnose like if and why Python and SQL are the wrong tools, and how one might go about like building a better PL interface for data scientists, ML engineers, and analysts.
Okay, a question that I didn't ask because I thought it was a little weird or maybe nosy is why you're asking on Twitter if anyone knew any female Rust developers. Because I will say Rust comes up just a shocking amount on this podcast. and I was wondering like what's driving the interest in Rust, and then if there was some reason behind looking for a female Rust developer, and if you actually found one.
Yeah. So full transparency, and I think like I maybe put some of this on Twitter too. Um, so like quick background is that, certainly earlier in my career, I felt like oftentimes like I wasn't getting invited to like the same set of events, et cetera, as some of my male peers. And therefore, like I wasn't getting exposure to like the same set of conversations, maybe even the same like opportunities to like potentially see deals and things like that. So like I feel pretty strongly that like we need to have like women in the room when we host events to ensure that like they're getting exposed to like the same set of opportunities, that like we're not doing things to like hamper their progress in the industries in which they operate. Um, we were hosting a Rust developer dinner and
Nice.
looked at the guest list, and like there weren't that many women, and felt like we could do better. So
Yeah,
thus the origins of my question.
I see.
Um, why Rust? Um, I wish I spent more time studying programming languages so could like better understand like why people are shifting from like C++ to Rust. Luca Palmieri, who I believe is now at AWS, actually has like a great blog post on why Rust might be a more appropriate like backend for Python libraries that often have C++ backends. Things like Pandas, where like we experience it as Python, but in fact, like it has a C++ backend. I've heard that like Rust is more accessible than C++, and therefore could perhaps like invite more data practitioners to actually like contribute to some of those projects. But I don't know enough to really say like why Rust is so magical. Other than, a lot of smart people apparently like Linus Torvald to believe it is. So if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for us. I don't know.
Fair enough. All right. Well, my final question for you is when you look at the sort of ML workflow today, kind of going from like, research to deployed into production, where do you see the biggest bottlenecks, or maybe where do you see the most surprising bottlenecks for, your portfolio companies?
Yeah. So I generally think that like there are two bottlenecks that I would call attention to. Actually three. Sorry, I'm being kind of indecisive here. Um, One pattern that I've observed with ML is that like we often iterate on ML driven applications or ML driven features more frequently than we iterate on like more traditional software features. So to give an example, like we may iterate on a pricing algorithm like far more frequently than we would iterate on a like navigation panel or an onboarding flow or something like that. Um, Earlier I was talking about like understanding how ML can solve like user and company problems. I don't really think we have enough insight into the way in which model performance correlates with behavioral data or like product engagement to iterate super effectively on models. And I think like that has been a limitation and one that could have like nefarious effects in the future. Um, Another big challenge that I see, and I alluded to this before, is like the challenge of building software applications around a prediction service or around a model. I think in the past, people might have talked about this as like a model deployment problem. The problem isn't like, containerizing your model and like implementing a prediction service in production. I think like that has gotten significantly easier. The problem is like connecting to like 5 different databases, each which have like different sets of like ACID guarantees, latency profiles, also connecting to like a UI service, potentially like connecting to other, application services. So like the problem is like the software development, like what you've got is a trained model, but like now you actually have to build a software application. And I don't think we have great tools to like facilitate that process either for ML engineers or for software engineers. And then around the same space, I also think that like the transition from like research to production can still and back can still be challenging. So perhaps like what a company wants to do upon seeing an issue associated with the model in production is actually see the experiment runs associated with that model so that they might get more insight into like what is now happening in that production environment. Like that shouldn't be difficult to do. But in the past, I think we really developed tools either for model development or for like ML ops. And we're starting to see some of the like pain points that arise when like those sets of tools are not coupled together.
Cool. Yeah. That all definitely resonates with me.
Lest I sound too cynical, like I am really optimistic about like the future of ML. I think we just need to do it like in a sane and rational way and be mindful of like what we're trying to accomplish here instead of just focusing on like flashy press releases and cool demos.
I was thinking as you were talking about like the hype cycle on like large language models and stuff. Like I was thinking like VCs probably feel the hype cycle like the fastest because like I'm like, man, we've like basically solved the Turing test and like no one cares. Like my parents like are like, what even is this? And it's like, come on, this is like awesome. Like look at it. But I think like every investor like knows about like stable diffusion, but I don't think like I mean I even come across like chief data officers at like Fortune 500 companies that are like, what's like stable diffusion? It's like, come on, you should know about this. But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, but I think like there's this awareness though of like, this is where the hard work starts.
Yeah. Totally.
Like, great. We're able to like generate like beautiful like artistic renderings based on like textual prompts. Okay. How do we generate like photos that are, equivalent to that which a professional photographer would produce? Because like that's what it's going to take to get like, a Getty Images or like Flickr to adopt something like Stable Diffusion. How do we make like automated rotoscoping so good that like video editor like doesn't need to correct the mask at all? Because that's what it's going to take for like Runway to compete with like some of the more traditional video editors. I saw through Runway that like the research is not good enough. Like they've had to do like a lot of like engineering as well as their own research in order to like operationalize some of these things.
Yeah.
And so like I am so optimistic about like the potential of the technologies, but like I also am realistic that like reining them in and actually like leveraging these technologies to like do good in the world or to like build great products is hard. Short anecdote, but I've been talking to a founder who is working on like brain computer interfaces and actually like developed this like technology where like effectively like it's able to read minds. Like you had to put on some big like helmet thing, but like once the helmet was on, it could kind of transcribe thoughts, and they were able to get it to like work. Now the founder like subsequently like shifted focus to like the gaming space, doing more work with like haptic interfaces. And I was asking him like, why didn't you pursue the mind reading tech further? And he said to me like, we couldn't find any great use cases.
Oh man.
And like, isn't that crazy? But I think like this is tech. Like sometimes you can do absolutely remarkable things with technology. But it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter unless you figure out like how to appeal to people and get them to use it, and like how to align that technology with an important set of problems. So like, I think that is the thing as VCs, we need to like continue to remind ourselves, because like, I mean, tech is not easy. Tech is not easy, but like people are not easy either. Like both are really hard. And like unlocking new sets of technologies often means that like we're granted, the opportunity to solve like really hard human problems.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess TLDR, if GPT-3 starts reading minds, like maybe we'll be able to find some applications for it, but we'll see.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was super fun.
Yeah, for sure. Bye.
If you're enjoying these interviews and you want to learn more, please click on the link to the show notes in the description, where you can find links to all the papers that are mentioned, supplemental material, and a transcription that we worked really hard to produce. So check it out.